Just a quick introduction about the speaker. Dr. Chaudhran has over 30 years of experience. His national and international clients include those in manufacturing, banking, finance, petrochemicals, electronics, and aerospace in the United States, France, Germany, Portugal, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait. He has spoken at numerous national and local conferences and has been a major speaker at internationally broadcast teleconferences to over 35,000 people on organizational change, TQM, and reengineering systems thinking and strategic planning. He holds a doctorate and master's degree in industrial organizational psychology. He's currently the managing partner at Organized Change Consulting, which can be visited at www.organizedchange.com. Now, this presentation by Dr. David will be for about 60 minutes, precisely for about 45 to 50 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for question and answers in the end. But please feel free to insert your questions in between, as Doctor would like to have it a bit interactive in the middle. If you have any questions, you can always raise your hand as well, or insert your questions in the Q&A box, and I would be happy to read them over on your behalf to Dr. David. So let me go straight and give rights to Dr. David. Hi, Dr. David, how are you? Good to be connected. And we can see your webcam, your slide share is already, so it's been shared. We can see the slide deck, so the floor is all yours. So please proceed with your presentation.
Very good. Thank you very much. And thank you all of you for participating in this. I'm not quite sure what the term is, so I will say good morning, good evening, and good day, depending upon where you are. Thank you again for having me as a speaker. And again, thank you again for taking your precious time in doing so. Is that, as you know, things have changed a little bit in the last 6 months, and that the question really becomes, what are we going to do? So this presentation is perhaps an indication, certainly not what the future will be, but it will give you some plans and some techniques to be dealing with potentially what might be happening. So that if you recall back in December of 2019, is that the United States had the longest string of growth in its history, that the unemployment rate was 3.5%, and the projected GDP growth for the United States was in 2020 was 2 to 3%. Now, it is certainly not that case. The IMF indicates that the US will probably decline about 8.1% in GDP, and that the unemployment rate is probably around 13% right now. And the Federal Reserve is estimating that the unemployment rate still in the fourth quarter is going to be 9.5%. So again, things have indeed changed quite a bit in the last 7 months, and that I think it's going to be quite important really for us to be dealing with this kind of situation. I know all of you are in something of a state of shock. I know certainly that I was. Something was inevitable, but whether it would be happening now or not is another question. And kind of in light of this, and no, this is not a picture of me. This is kind of the way that I feel. It's just, I survived sex, drugs, and rock and roll in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and I'm going to die from an unprotected handshake in 2020. So that really kind of combines this. There are these major issues that have gone on in terms of your own personal protection, your own personal safety, and you've come to survive the major things since you probably are older than 18. And then now all of a sudden, if you shake the wrong person's hand, you're going to be ending up in a major problem. Whenever you deal with these kind of situations, you really need to be thinking really in terms of 3 broad buckets in terms of time. And the first is the immediate thing. What do we need to do to keep safe? And what do we need to do to stay in business? Sometimes there are major cash flow issues that are going on, that all of a sudden you no longer may be having customers, that all of a sudden that your suppliers as well as your customers may invoke the will of God, the force majeure, and is in combination for that. Basically, they're stopping payments to you. They're stopping contracts. That obviously is something that guarantees will get your attention. The second kind of thing also what is going on is that you may be sensitive to the issues going on inside your business in regards to personal safety is that certainly that coronavirus has been contagious quite easily so in heavily crowded areas, many manufacturing areas, as well as many food preparation areas. Oftentimes people are quite close together, and in an unprotected setting, that can cause certainly a major contagions. For certain, you have the largest social issue about all of a sudden people are afraid to talk to each other, to communicate with each other, and that as a result of that, they may be going or attempting to go to an entirely online presence. For some organizations and for some types of industries, that's okay. For others, it tends to be much more difficult to do so. Going beyond the intermediate kind of issues is that you start talking about the short-term kind of things, and that how do we stabilize our cash flow? What kind of resources do we have? Not only is that we may be needing different resources, we may be needing smaller resources, or our resources that we use may be ill enough so that they can't work. You have other particular issues in regards to supply chain. Right now, there are a couple 100,000 people who are working on various transport ships that ship everything from one place in the world to the other. And in many cases, those poor, mostly guys, are not really going to be able to go home. And in some cases, they're not going to be able to dock. So they actually may be in prison, if you will, in all of those ships across the world. And this has been going on in some cases for months. You have other issues in regards to your customers, is that not only are those particular customers, their clients maybe having issues, and so they're not going to be able to pay you. And in addition to that, is that you have the issue in terms of your customers' needs may be changing quite a bit. Lastly and not leastly is that you may be dealing with new regulations, and that the regulations are not necessarily clear, and they are not necessarily permanent, and they for certain change from time to time. And this creates a very confusing situation for certain when you're trying to continue to run a business, but you don't know if you'll be allowed to work at all, whether you'll be able to work only outdoors, or whether you're even allowed to have any customers come into your places. But lastly, and not leastly, is that you also need to talk about and think about the intermediate term scenarios and strategies. And oftentimes, this is a very hard thing to do at the normal circumstances. However, in these particular times, it's very easy to get overwhelmed by so many of the things that are going on that it's very difficult to be thinking about the long-term consequences of what's going to be going on. However, is that it's all more important that what happens is that you actually do need to deal with these circumstances. And in the time between everyone running around panicking, you need to think about on how you need to position your business and your organization to be accommodating it in accordance so. To my mind is that an answer to this are what are called scenarios. And that scenarios tend to be very different from how companies normally plan their businesses. Oftentimes is that when people plan their businesses, they come up with a vision statement, they come up with a mission, and so on and so on. And all of which is very good. However, is that it assumes that everything is going to be wonderful, or everything is going to be like the past. And unfortunately, as you well know, those kind of things just aren't the case. And so the way around this is to be looking at the future not as if it's predictable, but instead predictable in the sense that there may be several different options that may come about. What do we need to be doing for planning them? And then on that particular kind of basis, then what do we actually need to accomplish? And so these are really what scenarios are. Is scenarios use multiple potential futures that take into account global, regional, industry, and organizational trends. Secondly, is that they use these factors to develop alternatives of what might happen. And thirdly, they use signposts and indicators to give a heads up that a scenario might come about. And I'll give several different examples of this for our own clients in the next hour or so. But I did want to bring up one particular example of someone, actually a company in San Diego, is they had gone through this particular kind of scenario planning exercise And one of the scenarios that they were discussing is that what would happen if there would be a major disruption in their supply chain? What would happen if all of a sudden there was a contagion that severely affected a lot of people? And oh, by the way, they happen to be in the medical device business. So they actually had contingency plans in place before this corona situation even started about what they might want to do should those circumstances occur. And as a result of that, they're able to pivot very, very quickly in terms of getting to have their people move from one place to the other, in terms of even what products they are developing. And they were able to have successful distribution arrangements in the circumstances very, very quickly, instead of just having this stunned look on their face, being completely, unaware about what to do and how to do it. So scenarios may not be able to save you from what happened in the last 6 months, but they will be able to help you in terms of the next several years, because these kind of things are very likely to be happening again. Is that some of the advantages of using these scenarios is that they don't assume the future will be like the past. And unfortunately, I've seen a lot of companies with a lot of the marketing analysis basically showing these very nice, pretty trend lines saying, okay, this is what's likely to be happening. And to some extent, those trends continue and will always continue. However, is that there are things that very well may be changing from time to time to time that cannot be taken into account if you look at the future as something purely linear extrapolation from the past. It allows for unexpected events rather than just looking at trends. It also allows for flexibility in planning, and it is adjustable when new data or opportunities come along. So when organizations come up with these particular kind of scenarios in terms of what actually might be occurring, is that this is not something that is going to be canned, fixed, and inflexible. This is something what needs to be reviewed periodically, and that can be adjusted and changed accordingly. And so you have a better indicator in terms of what particular scenario might be coming about compared to other ones. And by the way, it's also a great part, a great start for strategic planning. And again, this is something that is vital in terms of what needs to be done, because again, otherwise you're looking at the organization as something as a very static kind of circumstance. Some of the factors affecting scenarios include the political, the economic, social demographic, technological, competitive and disruptive business models, and the degree and pace of change. So let me go over this a little bit here and see in terms of how we can be dealing with these. Is though some business people don't really like in terms of dealing with politics, they are an essential factor of life. And this is something that what is vital and you simply just have to deal with. Certainly the political volatility in the United States in the last several years certainly has been a factor in many, many things. And as you can certainly see, sometimes the consequences are global in nature. Secondly, is that you need to be looking at economic issues. And that again, these economic issues are not necessarily those things that are immediate, like, uh-oh, we don't have our supply chain anymore. Other economic issues have to do with long-term economic trends. Believe it or not, if the trends continue, is that everyone will be above the level of poverty by the year 2060. And that trend has actually continued since for 150 years. And this may sound very different from what you're reacting to now, but you also need to be looking at the very long-term trends in terms of economical issues. Thirdly, social and demographic issues. For certain is that the huge youth bulge in so many parts of the world, including the Middle East, has a drastic effect in terms of what might actually be happening. For certain in the United States, you've seen the various economic, social and demographic issues that have come up in regards to race and gender lately. Certainly, in 2011, 2012, certainly you've seen the rise of the Arab Spring. and in terms of on how that large segment of the population that is so young taking an active political role, sometimes with positive consequences, sometimes less so. For certain technological issues certainly come into play, as that, give an example, is that if we were to be having this particular situation with coronavirus, let's say 15 years ago, the internet was not anywhere near what it was. Collaboration software is not anywhere near it was. And so you can imagine the economic devastation that might occur when you did not have this kind of remote working and collaboration capabilities. For certain, there are tremendous number of examples of competitive and disruptive business models. For certain, one prime example is Amazon and the rise of distributed goods and the like, so that I don't need to go to the grocery store if I don't want to. I don't need to be going and picking up food from a restaurant. I don't need to be basically doing much of anything. If I wanted to, I could just sit in my home and get everything delivered and never have to leave the house, which I don't think I'd really want to do, but certainly that might be an option. Lastly, and not leastly, is that we're talking about the degree and pace of change. And that sometimes change comes in a fairly linear kind of way and is somewhat predictable. But other times there can be substantive, qualitative change that immediately disrupts things. And for certain, the situation that what we're in now very much affects that kind of thing. And what I'm going to do right now, as what Mr. Ali had suggested, is that I don't want to let the questions accumulate all at the very end. And so I'd like to open this up for a little while right now to questions, and that where to, and that Mr. Ali, maybe you can ask some of them and I can answer them.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. David. And folks, as we had mentioned earlier, if you have any questions, you can always intervene now at this right time, as Doctor has opened the floor for Q&A in the between. So let me go to the question to the participants. There's a caller who has raised a hand. So we have Brother Muhammad Al Mardaf. Brother, you have raised your hand, Muhammad Al. If you can unmute yourself, I've enabled you to talk. Brother Muhammad Al Maruf, can you unmute yourself? You've raised your hand. All right, so let me go to the chat box. Can you share real life example of scenario analysis by Brother Muhammad, Dr. Muhammad?
Thank you, Dr. Muhammad, for your question. Yes, for certain, is that I'll get into more detail in a little bit, but let me give one example from one of our clients. Is that one of our clients is a Sony Interactive, that is the people who produce the PS4 as well as all the various games that go on it there. And they have an interesting situation in that there's a question of net neutrality. And I won't go too much into the details of that, but net neutrality is where a bit on the internet can go anywhere and nobody else's bit has any higher priority than anywhere else. And the rules for this are different from country to country to country. Relatively recently, the United States changed its net neutrality rules, and that may be affecting this. And you're asking, why does this affect games? Well, if you think about it, what if you're playing a game, and because you're in a particular country, you are able to access and interact with the game faster than anybody else? Well, that can really be affecting game development, right? Because you don't really want to be giving a fair or unfair advantage to someone when they play a game. So net neutrality has a real factor in terms of when you're talking about online gaming, especially because you want to be having a response time of less than 150 milliseconds. Another particular factor involving in Sony really had to do with the extent to which they wanted to have in-house games developed, that is developed by Sony, versus those kind of various game development houses that produce games. And so you can imagine that there would be a 2x2 matrix in terms of scenarios: net neutrality versus non-net neutrality, in-house game development versus out-house game development. So if you excuse the term outhouse. So those kind of four scenarios in terms of what we developed for them, and What their response to those scenarios would be, I cannot say. As you might gather, that's confidential information. But that's an example of, in terms of how scenarios can be used, and potentially quite significantly affecting strategy and process. And I know we have a bunch, but we have a bunch more questions too. I see a whole bunch here. Is it Mr. Ali?
Great. Yeah, great. Thank you very much. And thank you, Dr. Mohammed, for an excellent question. Let me go to another caller who has raised a hand. We have Mr. Bhovan Shotad. I hope I pronounced the name correctly. Mr. Bhovan Shotad, I have just unmuted you and allowed you to talk. If you can unmute yourself now. Bhovan Shotad. All right.
Thank you. Namaste from Nepal.
Yes, we can hear you. Could you please introduce yourself and ask the question, please?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for Mr. David. There are many factors affecting the scenario of survival scenarios and strategies in the COVID-19. And as you explained that the factors affecting are political, economic, social, and technological. How to use these scenarios in coming days to develop our business, or to go good way in future?
Yeah, and that's a very good question, and thank you for it. Is that I will be getting into detail on that really into the next several slides, and talk about a process in terms of how to be dealing with those kind of situations that are there for certain. And so when we get into that in the next few slides, if you have any questions during that particular time, I'd be glad to answer them also. And I think, Mr. Ali, we also have some ones also from the chat area too, besides the Q&A, I think.
Thank you, Mr. Bhavan, for a question. So let me go to the question box from Mr. Ahmed Saleh Mukhtar. The quality of simulations will depend on the quality of data collected. How can we improve on that?
You know, that's really the large question, and I think that I don't think it's a matter of if we can improve it. I think it's really a question of you always have to improve it. You always have to question your models. You always have to question your assumptions. You always have to be looking for, and I think this is the key, for disconfirming data. In other words, you have to be on the lookout for situations that may tell you that what you think is going to happen is going to be wrong. It's a natural kind of thing for human beings to have something called confirmation bias. And so if they think something is right, they look around for information to confirm that they are what they already believe. And that is assumption that is a very poor one when you do scenario planning. You have to deliberately look for those things that might disagree with what you think will happen.
Great, thank you very much. And so, Doctor, may I continue? There's another one in the chat box, if you allow me. Dr. David, so we can take one more question from Monter Al-Asadi. Hi, please correct my information. It seems most of these scenarios are qualitative. Can we transfer it to a qualitative? Sorry, to a quantitative?
Yes, very much so. One of the things that you do need to be very cautious about is, and I'm very much a quantitative person. I hate to tell you about how many semesters of statistics and experimental design that I've taken. It's the one thing that you need to be very cautious about when you deal with quantitative data is in essence, what you're really doing is you're extrapolating from the past. And that in itself can be quite valuable. But if you don't combine it with potentially qualitative information that can then be addressing these kind of things to say the trend lines that we're looking at, the correlations that we're looking at right now may be substantially changed in the future, that will be a problem. I mean, I'm very much in favor, to be clear, that if an organization is thinking about expanding its operations or changing its operations in a particular country, that they need to be going through scenario planning in part but they also need to be doing thorough market analysis to find out who the competitors are in that situation. If it's a growth market, what kind of things might be affecting that, how to deliver the product. All those particular kind of things very much have to be taken into account.
Yeah, thank you. And then we have another caller, Brother Muhammad Amrusi. Brother, you have raised your hand. You're unmuted. Could you please introduce yourself and ask the question? Brother Muhammad Amrusi, can you hear us? Muhammad Amrusi. All right, let me mute him again. So, yeah, that's about it, doctor. So we may proceed with the next part of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, I'll be stopping in the interim after the next couple of slides, and we'll be having this Q&A as an ongoing basis. And then, of course, as Mr. Ali had mentioned, we'll also have the more general Q&A at the end. So if you want to be looking at scenarios, you really can be looking at developing in terms of a scenario matrix. So that, for example, that if you were to be developing 4 scenarios, and this is oftentimes what we do with our clients, there have been exercises where they have been 20, 25, 50, and 100 different possible scenarios, but those tend to be for very complex organizations and, generally speaking, not what most people do. So you can think about 4 particular kind of scenarios, and one might be what as is, the second scenario might be modest improvement, a third scenario might be something that was modestly negative, and the fourth scenario might be something that is very bad. And that then in this particular case, you can be putting in a narrative in regards to each of these boxes in regards to the geopolitical, the political, the economic, the social, and the organizational issues that are facing should this particular kind of scenario come about. And this is the kind of thing that what we have done in, again, the past for our previous clients. And in some particular cases, excuse me, in some particular cases is that they have been involving very different kind of things. What I had mentioned previously is in some of the work that what we did for Sony, but the scenarios are not necessarily generic, and they have to be, in some cases, made very specific to a particular industry or a particular location. Is that when we have done these kind of things for our Middle Eastern clients, is that some of the issues that have been raised, for example, is to the extent that Iran might be having nuclear weapons, and to the extent that there might be social unrest in countries that are not used to social unrest, and on how those might interact with each other. And so, like I said, these kind of scenarios are not necessarily generic, but they very well can be made very specific to an industry or a particular location here. And so, as you can imagine, is the developing these kind of scenarios and developing these kind of narratives is not a quick and easy task, and that it does require a fair amount of time and effort to do. And to hark on to what one of the previous questioners had said, this also really has to do with looking at various quantitative kind of issues as well. In particular case in regards to demographics and the like, in the United States, for example, is that the youth bulge that so many third world countries have had for the last decade or so. We had our youth bulge. They're called the baby boomers, and I happen to be one of them. And so our youth bulge was really in terms of the 1950s and 60s, and that the United States population has generally aged, though because of immigration, it has not aged anywhere near as much as Japan and Western Europe has, for example. On the other hand, is that even when the youth bulge that the United States had, at most people under 30 were maybe 19, 20% of the population. You know, I know that, for example, in Saudi Arabia, that you have upwards of 2/3 of the population happen to be under 30. And that tremendous youth bulge with all of its risks and all of its opportunities is much more of a challenge in that circumstance. But just give an example that in part because of that youth bulge in the United States in the 50s and 60s, that's also when we had a tremendous amount of social unrest in regards to equality, in regards to the Vietnam War, in regards to gender roles, and so on and so on and so on. And that was really a major disruption in terms of American society. To my mind, generally for the better, but nonetheless, it was a major disruption. And so if you deal with circumstances that where the youth bulge is many, many more times that in terms of proportion of population, you have to think about some very different kind of scenarios in response. For certain is that what we are focused on right now is the economy, and that this is, to use an American expression, is the tail that wags the dog. Obviously, we're all concerned in terms of the drops in GDP, in terms of the mass unemployment that's occurring, in terms of the various mass disruptions, in terms of health and safety and so on are concerned. This is taken from the Wall Street Journal, and that these are some potential economic scenarios is for what actually might be happening. So what everyone is hoping for is a V-shaped recovery. That is, okay, we had a big drop, you know, this quarter and the next quarter, and then everything will be okay. That's a V-shaped recovery. A U-shaped recovery is where you have this drop and you have a very long, slow recovery to what is going on. You also have something of what's called a swoosh-shaped recovery in regards to the Nike emblem, the swoosh that they portray in their advertisements. And that is that where you have a sharp decline, but you have a more rapid recovery than a U-shape, but not quite a V. So in other words, it's not the sudden jump up, it's a gradual recovery, but it's still relatively quick. In the case of a Z-shaped recovery, is that you have a sudden decline. You then, because of various government responses, such as increased borrowing, such as the Federal Reserve issues, and so on in the United States, so forth and so on, and so on, is that you have this tremendous over recovery. And that is that where things become quite a bit hotter than what they were. And that in itself can certainly cause lots of problems too, because if you have an economy that all of a sudden overheats, then you have issues about inflation, you have issues in terms of prices, you have an interest in terms of all sorts of potential shortages that are going on and so on. So with the Z-shaped recovery is that you're looking at a sudden decline, a sudden pop up, and then a sudden decline going down, and then finally coming back to trend. With a W-shaped recovery is that you have the sudden decline, you have a pop up somewhat back to normal, but because that increase in GDP and so on was, if you will, artificial, that actually came from increased government spending, debt financing, and so on, that can only last for so long. There's another dip, and then finally, things are kind of coming back to normal. Lastly, and not leastly, is that you have an L-shaped recovery. And that is that where you have a sudden decline and things never really fully recover to what they are. Things slowly improve, but they will never in the foreseeable future actually really progress to where it was in the past. Some of the scenarios in that particular case are suggesting that because of increased government debt loads that we're taking on, that will really put a real break in terms of economic growth in the longer term. And so I think I just showed a whole lot of information right there. So Mr. Ali, if you will, I'm going to stop again and that open it up for questions, because I see we have a whole lot of questions, at least in the chat area that I know.
Sure, thank you very much. And let me see, in the chat box, we have a couple of questions. Where there are, and may I request the folks to please insert their questions in the question box. That would be much easier for me as a moderator to organize the questions, but let me go. We have from Muhammad Al-Masuri, the question is, on which data can we build our predictors scenarios? The old data are not helpful. The actual data are not sufficient and accurate to predict the future.
And that and the answer is, to my mind, the answer is that you can't. And in other words, is that what people are looking for, they're looking for certainty when there is none. And that's the reason why you actually have to be developing multiple scenarios, because you cannot come with a certain prediction, but at least you have a general idea about in terms of where you need to go. And so that's where you have to develop multiple scenarios and then update those scenarios, update the indicators almost on a moment-to-moment basis to find out if there are going to be any inflection points that may be indicating in terms of what is actually going on.
All right, thank you very much. And then we have another one from Brother Muhammad. Second, trying to scroll it in the chat box now. From Brother Muhammad Saleh, could you please clarify the curve once again?
Could I please clarify the
Curve.
Oh, I take it he means the various graphs and so on the page. Sure, is that again what people are really hoping to happen is a V-shaped recovery. You know, there's a sudden drop, and then all of a sudden, bingo, it's again, and everybody's happy and everybody's fine. The U-shape and the swoosh-shaped ones are more in terms of where there's still that sudden drop is what we faced, and there is a relatively a medium-paced recovery back to trend. The Z-shaped recovery is where things have declined. Things go really, really well for a while, but there are consequences to everything going really that well, and there's a decline again in terms of GDP and such. And then finally it gets back to trend. So it's kind of like a bump down, a bump up, a little bit of a bump down, and then going back to what it was before. The W-shaped recovery is where you have the sudden decline. You have things are getting better. Things are getting better maybe for artificial reasons, if you will. So things are declining again, but then recovering to ultimately to what it was going to be. And then lastly, not leastly, you have an L-shaped recovery. That is that where you have the sudden decline and you have a slow improvement of things, but it never really comes back to what the potential was pre-crisis.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And then we have another short question from Arijal Rashid. What is the percentage of economic recovery?
That's a darn good question. If you will, I'm going to answer your question in a larger sense. Is that I don't think we're going to have a V-shaped recovery. I really don't. I know the politicians really want that to happen, but I don't think it's going to. Simply just the economic dislocation is just too severe for us to be snapping back. And I think the likeliest situation to occur is actually the W-shaped recovery. That is that we're in the decline, we're recovering some, things are going to be declining again somewhat, and then finally bouncing back to what it was. And I have no substantive data for that, to be honest with you, but that's what my feeling indicates to me, is that we'll have a W-shaped recovery for there too.
All right. Thank you very much. And let me go. And thank you very much, attendees, for start posting questions in the Q&A box. And we have another one from Dr. Muhammad. What are the observed recovery types which you have observed so far of different countries?
You know, that really is very, very country dependent. I think that you've seen circumstances that where there has been a good response, if you will, and the infection rate has been has really gone down quite a bit. And if I recall correctly, I think it was Bolivia and so on, if I recall, that has done a very, very good job of that in terms of there as well. China, to some extent, has really done very well, though with some very interesting consequences to it. I think one of the consequences that what is of deep concern to me is that because of this infection that's going on, because of economic situations going on, it's an easy avenue for people, for politicians with authoritarian and dictatorial tendencies to use this as an excuse to take more and more control. And I think easily that is what is happening in China. It is easily what's happening in Hungary. It is easily happening in a number of other different kind of countries. Singapore has actually done fairly well also. So, and if I recall, I think that the GDP forecast for Singapore is actually positive for next year, if I remember right. With Germany, they've really controlled the infection pretty gosh darn well. Part of the problem with Germany, however, is that about half the economy is tied to exports. And so until the world economy starts really working well, and if I recall the IMF forecast, the global GDP for this year probably will be declining by 4.1%. So if I remember the number correctly. And so even though Germany has done very well, has actually provided some surprising economic stimulus, is that I don't expect their economy to be doing that well until the global economy recovers. Other questions, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. We have another one, sort of a supplementary from Brother Wajdi Abdul Jawad. Which recovery shapes do you expect for the global economy relative to COVID-19 crisis? I believe you have covered it, but if you want to take it again.
Yeah, it is that my guess, and it's no more than a guess, my friends, is that we're looking at a W-shaped recovery.
Yeah.
I really do. That's my guess.
Great. Then we have another one from Sister Salama. What is the possibility of recovery in Egypt and North Africa? Very precise about the countries.
If you really want me to be honest about it, in regards to the MENA region that does not have substantial commodity resources, meaning in other words, the MENA region outside the GCC, that is that, Egypt, Libya, Jordan, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, and so on. To be honest with you, I think it's more of an L-shaped recovery for them. I think because of the lack of political cohesion, I think because of all the violence that's going on in Libya, I think because of the various kind of political issues that are going on in Egypt, and that with a high youth bulge and combination of the two, I don't really suspect that things will be going very well for a long time. I wish I would think otherwise, but I don't.
Good. Okay, thank you very much. Another one from Mr. Dodd Al-Zahrani. If we faced L-shaped recovery, can we get back again to our previous normal condition?
No. Not unless you're talking about several decades. If you're stuck in an L-shaped recovery, you are looking at what was in the 1980s was called the lost decade. And that happened in South America, and that happened in Japan, where they have a combination of very, very slow growth, if at all, very high debt ratios, and things basically just kind of stuck, for lack of a better word. And until something really significant changes, I'm talking about significant political reform, significant economic reform, in terms of that word too, my deep concern is that L-shaped recovery will be around for a long time.
All right, thank you. And we have another one from Misfar Al-Maimuni. What is the impact on real estate development, especially the entertainment-focused projects?
Oh boy. Yeah, I mean, it's the economic, the entertainment industry and any industry that requires collections of people to be going into large groups. That's going to be quite difficult. And I need to kind of put this in context here. That everyone is hoping that, okay, good, we'll have a vaccine, by the end of 2020. And I think there's at least some probability of that happening, but that's not the issue. Is that One is that no one knows in terms of how long immunity will last. Secondly, is that even if you have an effective vaccine, you still have to produce 7 billion doses for everyone to be covered. 7 billion doses have to be produced, and 7 billion doses have to be distributed. And for all those things to occur, to my mind, we're talking about 2023, roughly 2 to 2.5 to 3 years from now before that happens in any significant kind of way. And so I think that the real estate issues, I think that the mall issues and the entertainment issues that are surrounding that and those kind of industries, well, there will be a huge hangover of that for a very long time. I hope I'm wrong, to be clear, but I don't think so.
Yeah, we have one more. So let me quickly go from Mohanter Al-Asadi. If the economic recovery options related to the scenarios results, so why we can't avoid the worst one?
Well, if you plan in a longer term enough horizon, you can. But it's not, but something like this, you and I don't have control of. This is the invisible hand of 7 billion people, and the US GDP being $19 trillion. And so you can't actually really control these kind of things. You can influence them a little, but you can't really control them. And so the best you can do sometimes is have a good indication that things are going to be coming about. And in your own area of the world, in your own industry, figure out on how you can best respond to that, to be taking advantage of whatever occurs and to be surviving and growing in response to that.
Great. Here's another one, an interesting one, rather a lucky one for a few. Is the curve applied for all type of business?
No.
What is the lucky sector to get the business curve?
Well, is that yeah? The answer to that one really is no. Curiously enough, the industries and the processes involved really have to be doing with things like remote distribution and remote collaboration. I think that's a pretty easy and obvious one. I really wish that I would have bought Zoom stock, back in January, because I would have been a whole lot wealthier given the bump up in stock price. It's certainly people can easily be talking about things like Amazon and the various local situations and the various local equivalents of there all over the world, in terms of them actually having a wow, we can really be benefiting from this. However, is that you need to realize is that even though Amazon had this tremendous increase in terms of the number of shipments that it produced to distribute all over the place, their profit declined. And so to have a whole bunch of business is not necessarily a blessing, at least in the short run. But if you peel back the layer of the onion, you will see that companies like Amazon are going to be successful. And I'll tell you why. 80% of the profits that Amazon make has nothing to do with goods, has nothing to do with selling products at all. 80% of Amazon's profits has come from what is called Amazon Web Services. Amazon Web Services is what runs Netflix, and what runs Zoom. And so Amazon is going to be benefiting not by distributing goods, but by providing the power and the servers from the internet.
Great, and we have a supplementary comment from Brother Muhammad Abdul Karim that he thinks it is the communication sector, which includes all the online services. Do you agree, Doctor?
Yeah, I think certainly that is one particular place that's an advantage. Let me go back to something that what we talked about 15, 20 minutes ago. And that is that the one area that really has been expanding and actually has been quite profitable is urban warehouse space. And that is that if you have to be distributing all these things, where are you going to be storing them? And so warehouse space in and around urban areas certainly has been a growth area in the United States. I don't know how well that is worldwide.
Great. No more questions. So, Doctor, you have any other slides that we may proceed?
We have, yeah, I've got a number of them here. All right. So, is that the other kind of circumstance too, that what you also really have is the question of how do you respond to these scenarios? And realizing that depending upon what scenario comes about, your organization may have to be making substantive changes in terms of what they do. And so this is really important to be considering, because just because you have a scenario that comes about that's positive doesn't mean that your organization has the capability to take advantage of it. And what may be a strength in one scenario for your organization may not be a strength, that may actually be a weakness in a different one. Now we start beginning to talk about using the scenarios in terms of strategy and in terms of organizational change. So kind of pivoting to that particular point right here. And so you can imagine, if you will, that when you think about the possible changes that your organization is going to have to incur, you can think really about it in two dimensions. One dimension is the extent of the problem. Is the problem affecting just one or two people? Or is it that's affecting the entire company? The other dimension is the severity of the problem. That is that, you know, if a problem is not really that much of a problem, fine, low severity, or this is a, wow, this is a major disaster kind of an issue. And so if you think about it, you're going to be having to be doing different things if you have problems that are of low severity and affect only one or two people, and compare that to if the problem is severe and the problem is quite extensive. There we go. So when we talk about these things, if you're only talking about problems that are of small severity, of low severity, and only affecting one or two people, now you're talking about hiring people, firing people, training people, giving feedback to people, giving 360 feedback and executive coaching, that kind of thing. On the other hand, is that if you have problems that are severe in nature and affect the whole company, you may actually having to be changing the entire company around, changing your business model, changing your organizational structure, and so on and so on. And the way to be looking at these kinds of changes is that they can be in four broad categories. And we call them level 1, 2, 3, and 4. So level 4 kind of changes are those things for relatively low severity problems that only affect a few people. And that on the other side, level 1 and level 2 changes have to do with multiple system, whole organizational change. If you remember anything from this presentation, this slide and the next slide, when you talk about strategy and change, are two of the critical ones. Because what very easily can happen, and I hate to tell you how many times I have seen it, is you have circumstances where the CEO reads a book or hears about something, and he says, we have to do this, whatever this is. And it's really not appropriate to the organization at all. He simply is just what's called managing by bestseller. And so he or she gets this new idea, says, we got to go do this. And the reality of it is there are hundreds and thousands of different kind of management techniques from all over the place, from all sorts of management consultancies. And they all work. but they don't all work in the right circumstances. And so you really need to be tailoring what you are doing to what's actually going to be giving an effect in the organization. One of the most important things to realize, and this is going to be obvious to anyone here, but it's not obvious in this circumstance, and that is, if you wish to cut down the grass in your lawn, you don't use a tank. If you want to knock down a brick wall, you don't use a lawnmower. And you're thinking to yourself, well, of course, naturally. But I'm sorry to say, this is what very often happens when you try to institute organizational change, is that people use a tank on the grass and use a lawnmower on the wall. And that's where a thorough assessment in terms of what may occur in terms of scenarios, what the current situation is in terms of your company, and the amount of changes necessary has to be thoroughly looked at to figure out what kind of changes really are going to be appropriate to your organization. These particular 4 levels, as I said, are basically in 4 general broad categories. Level 1 is changing and anticipating the future. And this involves, as what you might guess, scenario planning. I want to emphasize something here, is that it's not just anticipating the future. To some extent, it may be changing it. One of the things, what is a very strange thing on the surface, is that so many technology companies are involved in these small, not well-known standardizing bodies as far as protocols and communication issues and processes. And you kind of go, why would they ever be involved in these small esoteric kind of committees? And the reason for that, because they know that if they can influence the standards for what communication protocols, that is going to be to their advantage to do so. So to some extent, you can actually change the future and make it become what you want it to be, at least in some small sense. For most of us, though, we're talking about anticipating the future rather than changing it. Level 2 is defining and refining your mission and core competencies. And so this is what normally would be described as strategic planning. So what's the mission of the company? What are our core competencies? You know, what do we need to be doing to be achieving those kind of things? But I want to put a caveat here. I want to put in a caution. And that is that what you think is your core competence, what you think your company does really, really well, may actually become a disadvantage if certain scenarios come about. And I'll give an example. Let's take a look at Disney. Disney is considered a very, very successful company. They have made great acquisitions in regards to Pixar, Industrial Light and Magic, Marvel Group, and so forth and so on. So they've had been a powerhouse in the entertainment industry. But the Achilles heel behind that is that all of that assumed that you could get people together in large groups. And as all of us know right now, is that that's not easily done. And their operating profit last quarter dropped 91%. So in this scenario, what was a strength is now a weakness. Level 3 kind of changes basically talk about a fundamental change of business processes. And this, for example, would be such things as restructuring, selling chunks of the company, mergers and acquisitions, putting in a remote collaboration system, changing in terms of how you do enterprise resource planning, changing organizational structure in regards to pay, putting in pay for performance systems, and the like. So that's level 3 kind of changes involved in there. Level 4 kind of changes having to do with incrementally changing what you are already doing. And that is that you think you have a good scenario, you think you have a good strategy, you think you have the major building blocks in place, and that now you just need to incrementally improve what you are already doing. And an example for this, of this kind of technique is the Lean Six Sigma total quality management kind of aspects to it, where you are systematically, in the statistical sense, trying to improve the quality of your existing products. You know, these kind of techniques can be very, very powerful. I mean, I've been involved in implementing Six Sigma in an aerospace company, for example, and they achieved some tremendous successes in terms of improved efficiency. However, is that making a process more efficient assumes the process should exist. Assuming the process exists, assume that the right strategy is in place of the company. And the strategy in place assumes that the scenario you're coming about is going to be coming. And so you can kind of see that where if you can be improving something that doesn't need to occur. And unfortunately, give an example of that is that this one particular machine shop, a client of ours, they had done a lot of work in terms of improving the quality and productivity of the parts they were producing. The CFO, this chief financial officer, found out about it, was walking in the shop and said, "I didn't understand why you're doing this. We're going to be shutting you guys down." And so because of that lack of communication, the people in the machine shop had done a whole lot of work for something that no longer needed to be done. So that's on how all of these can be netted together. So I'm going to stop now again and ask for questions, because I know there are a number of questions and so on involved in there. And so Mr. Ali, if you'll continue with the questions again.
Thank you very much. And folks, we are back to the question and answer session. So there's one which is again back to the recovery slides that you were showing. How about the oil sector? Is it will be what will happen?
Yeah, that is a darn good question. Is that I think it really depends upon your time horizon. Is that in the longer term, you're talking about the decline of oil usage. That is that oil, as far as a method of propulsion, in other words, gasoline and that kind of thing, that's going to be declining in the long run. The cost efficiencies involved in terms of solar and wind power and the like are already pretty close to being competitive in terms of oil that way. Just a matter of putting the technologies in place for storage and the like to be accomplishing that. So that's a really big challenge. So in the long run, no, I don't think that oil is going to be it's going to be a declining portion of the various commodity-based economies in terms of there too, just because the demand is going to be slowly but surely going away. In the very short term, there's some interesting talk going on. And that is that because of the decline of capital investment in the last year or so, that there may actually be a spike upwards in oil next year, because all of a sudden there's going to be all of this supply that's going to be basically not going to be replenished anymore. And there may be a spike upwards in oil prices. Mind you, I don't think that spike is going to be lasting for very long, because what's going to be happening is that U.S. shale oil production will then ramp up again, and the price will again decline. But like I said, I think there's going to be probably a spike in the oil price, maybe about a year or so. But in the long term, it's not going to be viable.
Great, thank you very much. We don't have any more questions, but Doctor, I'm curious to find out at what level should a company start?
Yeah, you know what? That's a darn good question, and my answer is you have to hire us to tell you that. But it really depends upon where the company is. If they are facing a crisis, you have to start with the crisis. So however small or large that is, whatever you have to do. Ultimately, though, every company is going to be having to use all of these. Where you start in the wheel, that varies from company to company. For example, is that when we did work for it was for a Saudi company, and I won't name it here, is that they were going to be opening up a new division and going into a completely new different line of business. And so in response to that, we actually started with different scenarios in terms of involved in there. In other particular cases is that where the company was making a change in terms of their location. And in response to that, they really need to be doing some level 3 kind of changes, some fundamental changes of their business processes to be accommodating that. So it really depends upon the gap between where they need to be and where they are. And the bigger the gap, the more it suggests that you use level 1 and level 2 techniques.
Great. There's another one from Hunter Al-Asadi. What about of the change of business module? I think this is very important during the disruptive changes.
Yeah, I mean, you may need to really be changing in terms of how you make money. I mean, just to give a quick example is that so many companies, I'm going to say 3 months ago, regardless of what they were doing, started making masks and plastic protective shields. They had no experience doing any of that, but they literally had to change their business model very accordingly because that's the only way they could make money.
Great, great. So there's another one from, it's an anonymous. So the changes in the level 4 considered to be the level with the lowest impact on the organization, as there are not a lot of changes should be happening.
Well, yes. I mean, the good news behind level 4 techniques is they're not very disruptive. The bad news is the business may need to be disruptive. And that's really where the problem is. So in other words, the things that are easier to do may not fix your problem.
Great. So we don't have any more questions, Doctor. So do you have another more slides?
I do. So
Sure.
Let's get back into, okay, now what do we do with all of this? So, I mean, this has been a lot of information just in terms of presenting to you. I mean, I granted all that, but then the question about it is, what do you do with that information? What's the process involved in doing that? And that this is our strategy and systems change model. And so this builds on and is part of what we were just talking about. Is that the first very step that what you need to do is that a company or an organization needs to be answering what we call the framework questions. And that is that who's going to be the decision-making body? What kind of initial assessment of the company should we do? What kind of change are we contemplating? What kind of information do we need to be gathering? How do we gain consensus? You know, is it just going to be the senior executives saying, you know, we need to be going off in this direction? Or is it going to be more of a consensus building activity? How do we ensure implementation? And how do we evaluate what we've done? So these right here, I said what we call the framework questions that regardless of what the circumstances are, is that really need to be answered. And so that's hopefully one of the entry points to our clients to be helping them answer these particular kind of framework questions. Once a steering committee is formed, one of the decisions what they need to be making is the choice of level question. And that is that do they need to be doing scenario planning? Do they need to be doing strategic planning? Do they need to be changing their business processes? And do they need to be improving what they've already done? And if the business is complex enough, different lines of business may have different answers to this. We've worked with, for lack of a better word, these large conglomerates in the Middle East that have businesses and all sorts of different kind of aspects to this. You know, it's one of the circumstances, you know, where one brother does this one kind of business and this other brother does this and the sister wants to do this. And so you have this business that has all sorts of different parts to it in very different kind of industries sometimes. And that depending upon the circumstances, depending upon the scenarios, some of them simply just may need to be doing incremental improvement. Others may need to be doing some rather substantial improvement. Regardless of what level they decide on, they need to then be coming up with what goals they want to achieve. They then need to be deciding what kind of strategies and methods they need to be using to be implementing those goals. They need to be defining the measurement system. And in some cases, it's simply asking the question, you know, we have a project, how do we make it successful? And other circumstances, it may need substantially changing how do we measure success across the entire company. What's going to be our implementation plan? What kind of organizational changes are we going to be making? And how do we evaluate its success? So regardless of whether you start making big changes or small changes, you still need to be going through this process, the goals, strategies and methods, measurement system, and implementation plan. And this is something that, what I'm very sorry to say, a lot of organizations just don't do. They come up with all these wonderful plans and make all these really pretty pictures and these wonderful looking PowerPoints, and if necessary, produce these wonderful paper documents, and then they don't do anything with them. And I'm sorry to say, I'll give you an example, and that there was one particular client of ours in a Middle Eastern country. Again, I'll make it ambiguous. And before we started working with them, they had done 360 feedback, that is feedback on someone's management style, of their top 3,000 people. And 3 years later, that information hadn't even been distributed, much less used. That causes a tremendous, not only a waste of money, but a tremendous amount of frustration on the part of a lot of people. So if you're going to plan on doing something, you really got to go do it. Now, regardless of this, almost for certain, you're going to have to be doing additional assessments. You're going to have to be working on teamwork and consensus. And there probably is going to be a fair amount of training that has to go on. Now, whether specifically where you have to be doing these assessments and teamwork and training or not, that's really hard to specify beforehand. That really is going to be part of the implementation plan. And so you can't be quite so linear, if you will, when you look at the process. But you know you're going to have to be doing some teamwork stuff. You know you have to be having some training done. And you know most likely you have to have some additional assessments that are also going to need to be done. And that, if you will, one of the things that what we have done is we've actually developed collaboration software to be accomplishing that process. And we call it Consensus Builder. And that if you want to take an example of that, take a look at that, these are the links to it on the website. Some of this is actually in Arabic as well, for those of you whose primary language is Arabic. And so you could be taking a look at more of these kind of things. But I've done this on paper. It can be done on paper, but it's messy. And with the software, the collaboration software that we developed, it makes it a lot easier and a lot better to be able to consolidate it for everyone's decisions. But anyway, that's this. And we have roughly, I think, about 20 minutes, left, Mr. Ali. Is that I think there are some more questions and so on for there too, and I'd be more than glad to answer them here as well. Otherwise, the presentation is done.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for a very, very intriguing presentation. And I'm glad the experiment went pretty good in terms of engaging the audience throughout, and it turned out to be quite an interactive experience for all of us. So thank you very much. But one last question from Brother Wajdi Abdul Jawad. Do you consider change itself as directive, a continuous need, a policy, or an objective, or all of that?
Yeah, that's a darn good question. And I'm going to really have to say all of that. And change in and of itself, and when you're starting to talk about major kind of things, really needs to have a plan and a process. But it's the realization that change is going to be happening all the time, and the things that you are comfortable with may be going away. And that's a hard thing for people to deal with in general. And it also is a way to be substantially increasing the feelings of insecurity that they have around their job. So that it really tends to be overemphasized, if you will, in when most people talk about organizational change. But the consensus building involved in terms of actually working together with people, not only in terms of a planning sense, but an ongoing sense, is really vitally important in terms of what needs to be achieved.